So that's here. So just as a reminder to everyone, kind of the project's aims and objectives are to advance understanding of flood risk reduction benefits that marshes and marsh adaptation have in the lower Neponset River estuary, and to develop a recommended long-term adaptation framework and near-term first phase project for ecosystem to achieve ecosystem benefits as well as long-term flood risk reduction benefits. And that's a long-winded way to say that we are developing some modeling to understand how changes to the marshes that we could implement might affect flood risk, and really recommend a first thing to do as we look to the future. The thing that has the most advantage and has the most community support across the 3 municipalities. So just as a quick update of what today is about and what today is not about. So today's presentation is meant to show some early modeling results for how flood risk is reduced and under different marsh extent scenarios. And these are very broad categories. And we're also looking at ways to categorize active intervention in marsh extent before we see its impact on flood risk reduction. And so we're looking at things at a very broad, high-level view and trying to basically bin out the things that we might be able to do to restore it before we know what that impact will be in terms of flood risk reduction. So that means we're really not today suggesting that any change to the marsh elevation or allowing marsh migration is uniformly possible across the estuary or even feasible. And we're not really prejudging these adaptation approaches. We're just today asking the question, are these the right categories to be looking in to throw into the model? So we might talk about things that seem extreme, but they're not recommendations. They're just making sure we're capturing the right, we're bookending the approaches the right way. And I think as we go through this, we'll try to reemphasize that, but making it clear that we're not really recommending anything at this point.
So Sean,
yeah,
a little technical issue. Maybe we need our consultant. So for the people who are on Zoom, they're seeing the slide, but part of the slide is covered by this logo, which I have no idea what that is. I don't know if that's supposed to be like your face or what it, because obviously it's not on the. Yeah.
Do you have speaker view
does
on?
that get rid of it?
No, still there. Oh, something just happened.
Is it gone?
That fixed.
There, it's gone. Okay, cool. I was trying to.
I think it was I think it was a way to show my face without the camera on. All right. All right. And so just as a reminder of kind of where we're drawing the boundaries of the Neponset Estuary, since it's a little bit of an ambiguous place, it's the Dorchester neighborhood of Boston, the town of Milton, and the city of Quincy. And really the extent we're looking at is the 1% storm, 1% flood event. So the 100-year storm for a flood event in 2070. So it's kind of where we expect to see flooding at the most extreme end in 2070. It's kind of setting the boundaries of where we're looking. So it kind of constrains our modeling and our approach. But you can see it extends out in Dorchester down Gallatin Boulevard and quite away inland in Quincy because of the way the elevation works out. So where we are in the project process, we started out this phase of our project kind of looking at the existing conditions. We were calling the State of the Estuary Report, just looking at the health of the salt marshes all around the estuary. We're hoping to publish in a user-friendly version imminently, and kind of setting the base conditions is what the marshes look like now, how they've been impacted by 400 years of sitting between Boston, Quincy, and Milton. Then in our February meeting, we talked about performance goals. So making sure that when we look to the future, what are the things we want to see out of these marshes? So not just flood risk reduction, but ecosystem benefits, and, habitat for species, and a number of other things like accessibility for existing bike paths or future access to green spaces. Since then, we've developed these potential adaptation approaches, and we're going to talk about them with you all today, and that's where we are right now. So Woods Hole Group and Scape have laid out some adaptation approaches, and they're going to explain the way they work and what they mean, and make sure that everyone in this room and not in this room, and we'll touch base with them later, but that these are the right ways of looking at it, and that we're throwing the right things into the model. And then when that happens, we'll talk about this in terms of next steps. We'll end up with that first phase project. What's the best bang for our buck right now in terms of minimizing flood risk and promoting marsh health that actually has, some feasibility for us to get underway on. I think that leaves us with the project work plan. So today we're talking to you all. And for those in the room and those who are not in the room that we'll catch up and follow up with, any feedback you have on the adaptation approaches, I will follow up with you if there's more things to think about, but we really love it if you get some feedback to us by June 11th. That will allow the modeling team to really run with the results and keep us on track. And in the next steps, they'll take that feedback and these adaptation approaches to run through the model and determine how they impact flood risk and how they affect the presence of salt marshes through the summer. And hopefully we'll be getting back to you guys in early September for the next check-in meeting. And hopefully by that time we'll have a project in line that we can run by everyone and get some buy-in, and then start looking for ways to implement it. And with that, I think I'm going to hand it over to Kirk over at Woods Hole Group.
Great, thanks, Sean. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes?
Yes.
Great. So I'm going to walk through some of the findings from our initial modeling cases that we looked at across the marsh. Next slide. And as a reminder, here's kind of the situation today throughout the Neponset Estuary. So this is a cross section looking from the estuary itself and then advancing inland as you go to the right. This is just a representative schematic. So the marsh has, open water, intertidal areas, and then salt marsh of various conditions, mud flats, salt pan. This is essentially a representative kind of area. You do have some invasive species, Phragmites, towards the upper side of the marsh range, and then you get into upland and developed area. Next slide. The current marsh is facing some real stressors on it, not the least of which is, sea level rise. As that goes up, it would tend to render the marsh plain at an elevation that will no longer support healthy marsh. And we have other issues with edge erosion and things that anthropogenically humans have done in the past with ditching and berming and putting in culverts. And we have that creates problems with supersaturation and ponding. And we have stormwater runoff that gets redirected into the marsh system, bringing in pollutants and nutrients. We filled in certain areas. And so there's a lot of stress on this system. And it's all heightened by the fact that we have changing climate conditions that are influencing the system as a whole. Next slide. So what does that mean? Well, there's a couple of things. One, certainly the ecosystem is being affected, the natural resources, the health of the marsh. And in addition to that, there's potential co-benefits that are being lost due to the potential degradation of the marsh system. And that relates to upland flooding. So this is just a really simple, hopefully graphic that on the left side is what we're experiencing sort of today in terms of an annual storm level, which is the dark blue, and then kind of the 10% storm level shown is an increase in the purple areas that might be flooded. But by 2070, what we'd expect is the annual storm is really expanded quite drastically in the dark blue on the right-hand side. And then the 10% level, which is a 1 in 10 year type return period storm, really expands quite a bit further. And what the real mission of this assessment here is to identify, well, if we let the marsh kind of go and it falls into the trap of all these stressors and we lose a lot of marsh and it becomes mud flat, what does that really mean in terms of potential flood risk? What levels of benefit does the marsh offer beyond, the inherent ecosystem and really important natural benefits that are there? But what about the co-benefits for protection that are afforded by the marsh itself? And looking at that from a kind of a regional perspective throughout the entire estuary as a starting point. Next slide. So we started by kind of looking at these broad scale situations of what the future might be for the Neponset Estuary system. And this modeling is trying to give us a real idea of what could be in store as kind of on the whole, and help guide kind of what we might be thinking about in terms of adaptation. So the results of this kind of hope to tell us where does the marsh make the biggest difference? How does it really function overall relative to current and future flooding conditions and water levels? And so these base cases provide that foundational understanding of what we're kind of dealing with. And then we can work through, as Pippa will tell you later, exactly what type of adaptations might make sense throughout the entire system. So there's 4 cases that we really looked at the broad scale. One is this static elevation case. That really is like, we're not going to do anything to help the marsh. There's not a lot of natural sediment supply in the system. In fact, there's not a lot in the Northeast in general. And that has to do with damming of the rivers and just general sediment supplies overall. And so sea level rise is outpacing quite drastically the sediment deposition in the area. So if we don't do anything that's that static elevation case, eventually the marsh will be drowned. And if we don't let it migrate anywhere either, we're just going to end up with a lot of mud flat and open water. And that's really the most kind of true to form case if we don't intervene at all that could happen in what we're facing in the future. The second one is marsh elevation. So that's the idea that we're going to try to give the marsh a hand, at least elevationally, and say, hey, where it is now, we'd like to keep that marsh in those areas where it is now and support it and restore it and make sure it's fully functional and thriving in the area it is now. And then case 3, which is called marsh migration, is, well, we're going to not necessarily put elevational information in. We're going to let the marsh kind of take control and let it go where it wants to go. How does it migrate over time? It's going to move into the upland. We're not going to stop it. We're going to let it go. And what does that mean? We're going to lose marsh, but we also might gain marsh in areas as well. And then the last case is called transitional marsh, where it's kind of a mix of 1 and 3, which is we're going to let the marsh migrate in certain areas, open space, natural areas, but anywhere where there's development, we're going to halt that migration. What does that mean? What does that look like? And again, none of these are cases where we're actually proposing something to do here. This is providing kind of the bookends of what the future might be for the marsh system as a whole, so we can evaluate what do those kind of big scale movements in the marsh system in the future really mean. Next slide. So if we take a look at that from a plan view, here's what the static condition looks like. Really, we're not changing anything in the marsh. The marsh edges erode based on what's happened historically. And what we do is lose a lot of the marsh area to mud flat due to the sea level rise. And again, as I mentioned, this condition is kind of the most realistic representation of reality without any interventions. And that figure over on the left shows, the yellow is really the marsh loss. So you're losing all that marsh area primarily due to the sea level rise and lack of accretion on the marsh plain. And, it's a pretty big change in the marsh condition. So that's the static condition. Next slide. If we kind of compare that to case 2, which is us getting involved, saying, hey, sea level's coming up, but we're going to help the marsh out. We're going to try to raise that elevation at a similar rate to what sea level rise is doing. And that could change in the future, right? It could go slower than expected, might go faster than expected. But what we're really looking at is incremental gains in the marsh accretion. And that could happen naturally through maybe better sediment supply, whether it's dam removals or not, or us actually bringing in compatible sediment and raising that elevation. And so on the right-hand side, that elevational gain or that marsh accretion are all those hatched areas there where we're basically saying, hey, where we have marsh now, we'd like to make it, 1, better, restore it, and 2, make sure we don't lose it. So keep up with sea level rise. So that's case 2. Next slide. When we start to kind of compare those two cases, and these are results from the hydrodynamic model, then we're looking at how the water depth changes in these two cases. And this is looking at an annual storm projected in the 2070 climate horizon using state standard sea level rise cases. What you see on the left-hand side is that case 1 static conditions, where we're just kind of letting the marsh go, but not migrate. Case 2 is we're doing our best to kind of keep it healthy where it is now. And you can see how that kind of changes the depths in the area. So blue would be increases in water depth, or deeper water, and the greens would be shallower water. And you can certainly see the changes on the marsh plains themselves, which we raised, but you also see changes in upland areas due to that increased marsh elevation and the vegetation that you support as opposed to mudflats. Next slide. And then what we're looking at here is the change in the flood extents between case 2 and case 1. So on the left-hand side, anytime you see that yellow area, that's something that would be flooded if we don't help the marsh out and let the marsh go. And when we do help the marsh out, that yellow area goes away, meaning it's not flooded anymore. So the marsh, anywhere where you see yellow, the marsh is actually responsible for reducing the flooding in those areas. And some of it actually influences, some significant infrastructural areas. And then on the right-hand side, even more so, is the difference in flood depth. So even if you might have water in a certain area, say at your house, it makes a pretty big difference if it's 6 inches or if it's 2 feet. You can probably deal with 6 inches of water potentially, but maybe 2 feet starts to get into your house and cause problems, get into the basement, right? So it's not just the extent of flooding, but it's also the depth of flooding. So what we're seeing here in this particular case is the marsh does have a fairly decent influences on a whole throughout the whole system to maybe help promote some of the flood risk reduction. And now I would tell you that if you are on the open ocean with a really small marsh and you do this, you will probably see no difference whatsoever in the changes. But because the ratio of marsh we have in the Neponset Estuary, which is pretty large, relative to the water body, which isn't as big, now you're starting to see what we think is somewhat of a difference in flood risk reduction caused just by the marsh itself. Next slide. And then you can start to look at bigger storm events. This is a 10-year storm event, similar in terms of depths between case 1 and case 2. And if you go to the next slide, you start to see how that changes. Now you see the yellow again is some flood risk reduction. You see the depth changes again. Still see some pretty big depth changes in area, but you see less flood reduction. And that just has to do with the size of the storm. So as you get bigger and bigger storm events, the marsh has less and less ability to really be able to handle that. So if you have a 1% chance storm or 100-year storm condition, it's less likely that the marsh will be able to actually do a significant job in flood risk reduction. And that's okay. That just means that when you have really, really big storms, all bets are off, right? But for the more frequent storms and the storms that we expect to see certainly more often in the near and longer term future, the marsh seems to have a really big effect on those. Next slide. Then we did similar comparisons to these marsh migrations and marsh transitional cases compared to the no action kind of static where we let the marsh kind of go away, so to speak. And so this gets a little bit more complicated. In this case, in case 3, we're letting the marsh go wherever it wants to go. So the new marsh areas are shown in green. New marsh areas that were developed where it wants to migrate to are shown in purple. Go to the next slide. We can again look at the model results here and see what that starts to look like. A little less difference here because we're essentially letting the marsh migrate, but still lose itself to the sea level rise and increasing water levels. And if you go to the next slide, the differences in this case become a lot less evident, right? So the marsh is essentially losing, but also gaining in certain areas where we have developed. So the flood risk reduction is not as prominent. Now you do see some depth differences in certain areas because of what's happening there, but it tends to be actually increases in flood depth because again, the marsh is being allowed to migrate wherever it wants to go. The big changes we see in case 3 versus case 1 is an expansion of the marsh on the whole. Even though we're losing some, we're gaining marsh in areas because we're saying, hey, we're going to let that grow and migrate where it wants to go. Next slide. And then there's similar type of things for the 10% storm when you look at marsh migration. And you can go to the next one again, Sean, where we're starting to look at those types of differences. Not much change here when we get in bigger storm events due to marsh migration. And then the next slide. And then the last case comparison we looked at was this restricted marsh. So we're letting the marsh migrate somewhat in areas where we're like, okay, it's open space, maybe it's a park area or it's undeveloped. We're letting it go. But in other areas, again, is just a test of how this works. We're saying we're not going to let it migrate in this area. So if it's a developed area, if it's infrastructure, roads, buildings, we're saying don't let it go in there. Let's stop it. Let's see what that does. Next slide. In the model results for that provide another point that gives us some information on what's happening. Again, you can see the depth for the no action case versus the depth for the proposed case. And if you go forward, it's hard to see the differences here, but there is certainly some reduction in flooding where we've stopped the migration and the flood waters from going in these areas. Again, this is really just for us to learn more about what that means, and then reduction in depth in those certain areas. Go forward. And that's for the annual storm. We also have the 10-year storm, and you'll see in the next slide a much more drastic difference in certain areas, especially in depth, where we're saying, hey, we're just going to let the marsh die out in these specific areas and try to maintain it in other areas. And so we lose a lot of marsh. We do provide flood protection, but that's primarily directly caused by our intervention of elevational stopping of the water in these storm events. Next slide. So this is real quick, just a summary. We have to still finish out the land area that's flooded explicitly, but just the number of buildings that would be flooded in the various cases. So, just by trying to help maintain the marsh, we basically flood 100 less buildings than we do with if we let the marsh kind of just go and don't do anything and lose the marsh. And that doesn't account for the depth reduction that we're gaining as well. That's just extent of flooding. Obviously, you're letting a few more buildings flood if you let the marsh migration, actually losing the buildings to the marsh and moving them. And then in transitional, we're just stopping the flooding in some respects. So that annual storm has, less of an impact. Notice there's not much difference once you get in real bigger storm events. The changes to the number of buildings flooded is a lot less. And then if you go to the next slide, this is pretty interesting because now we're looking at what we have in terms of marsh. And so case 1, if we just let it go, we're basically losing 340 plus acres of marsh loss throughout the Neponset Estuary. Case 2, we're actually maintaining that, right? There's no loss, no gain. We're trying to maintain it. Case 3, we lose about 100 acres. We preserve about 242 when we let the marsh take the rule, but we actually gain 66 acres in undeveloped areas and another 58 in developed impervious areas. So we actually gain marsh over the long term. Nature tends to find its way. So we gained 24 acres overall by integrating a marsh migration effect. And then transitionally, we're trying to say, hey, we're not going to let it go into those developed areas. We actually net lose 34 acres in that. And those are just some stats on what those systems mean. We're using these model results again as that foundational information. Next slide. So the key takeaways from some of these baseline model conditions, and Pippa's going to get into how we then advance into more specific adaptation approaches and then model those specifically, is that really flood risk, is increasing throughout the whole system. We're losing marshes. We're going to have an increasing storm frequency, but we do see that the marsh is playing a role not only in the overall health for fisheries and the ecosystem and habitat area, but also is providing some co-benefit in an area. And that case 1 versus case 2 really indicated that. And it does work in certain areas and doesn't work as well in other areas. So as you go further upstream, we tend to see more benefits of the marsh because you have more marsh that the estuary system is working with and the storm surge and coastal waters have to get through. If you're way downstream, you see less of a benefit overall. For case 2, we see both reduction in fringe and penetration-based flooding. So that's keeping the marsh where it is, as healthy as we can. And it does reduce depths by up to 2 feet in upland areas. So that depth reduction is fairly significant. For the unrestricted marsh migration, that's case 3, letting the marsh rule the day. We do see some minor changes in flooding. We have a net gain in marsh. Some of it's lost, but a lot is gain. And it allows regularly flooded areas to become marsh, but does not really provide that co-benefit of there. So, there's a mixed bag when you start talking about unrestricted marsh migration. For restricted marsh migration, targeted restriction can provide some benefits, but it needs to be coupled with a healthy marsh, because if you lose it all, you're going to have other problems with the system. So you really need to look at project approaches that benefit both the marsh and protection, kind of these hybrid approaches, really a mix of, case 2, 3, in some places 4, to really get your optimized marsh health and co-benefits for flood risk reduction. And then the last thing is, we do see diminishing returns with increasing storm size and strength, and not necessarily sea level rise by itself, but bigger storms mean that the marsh has a harder time providing that co-benefit or that protection, but it does still have high value in the more frequent events, which we expect to see more and more often, because as sea level goes up, those events are really interacting with your nearshore upland areas much more frequently, and that's where the marshes really show their power, so to speak. So ultimately, really smart nature-based approach protection coupled with marsh health is really important from the overall system resilience from these baseline cases. When we get into the next round of modeling, we're really going to get into specific adaptations and how those perform within each kind of area within the marsh. And that really will show us where targeted adaptations really provide overall restoration and co-benefits. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to Pippa, and she's going to talk a little bit about, we have a Q&A session that we need to go through first.
Yeah, so maybe you take a breather and see if anyone has any questions. I know there's a lot of maps and views and it's a lot to digest, but anyone has any questions about? Yeah.
Two questions. You sound like one of my kids. Anyway, so anywhere where there's mud flats now, it's going to be underwater 24 hours probably in the future, so that.
Ye-
Yeah.
You know.
Yep, that's correct. Yeah, so mud flat areas now slowly make their way to become subtidal or open water areas. So
Yeah.
yes, that's
Which-
true.
Which is a loss to the birds that feed on the mud flats, but, and the other question I had, just to reassure myself, when you're talking about places that, don't want to allow for the marsh, what we call restricted areas, in other words, developed areas. So they're gonna get flooded unless they build some kind of walls of embankments or berms or something, correct? And if that happens, that water is gonna be diverted somewhere else.
Yep. So in case 4, what we did is we did exactly that. We didn't put walls up, but we did use berms and other types of elevational approaches to evaluate what would happen in that case. I will say it's really, this idea that water is diverted and increases somewhere else or it floods somewhere else. It's really hard to do that, to be honest with you, unless you get really far upstream in a really confined area, because even if you take what you think is a lot of water that's proceeding into an area that floods, you take all that volume of water and put it back into the ocean, you're not going to increase the ocean much at all, right? It's such a big volume of water, big area. So imagine if you fill up a bucket and you're like, wow, that's a lot of water, but you go throw it in your swimming pool, you're probably not going to see the swimming pool water elevation change much. And that's kind of how this flood redirection works is, you redirect that water. That's true. It goes somewhere, but it's in such a big body of water that you see no real increase in the actual water level. And that's what drives flooding in other areas. So it's something we always look at. And certainly if you get in a really confined setting and you have a block a whole bunch of water, that can happen. But generally speaking, when you're dealing with big bodies of water, oceans, harbors, those type of things, flood redirection really isn't a problem in terms of flooding a neighbor. What is a problem is redirection of flood waters through velocity or confining of flow paths. That can be a real issue. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thank you.
I had a couple of questions. One, just to note that I don't think we've really discussed before, is that when you look at that flooding area, the exiting in case of evacuation of Boston are Adam Street going down into the Lower Mills, Granite Ave going into Milton along where the highway is and everything else, and then the bridge going over to Hancock. I never considered on this before, and I don't think we've discussed it. That's how people would be directed to leave Boston if there was, some sort of an issue that was going on. So I just think that at some place we need to note it because I think that could impact an awful lot of people. The other part I was looking at was development now. I mean, it's good we're looking at 2070, but 2070. And I know that is I think we mentioned before, is at Granite Ave, there's one development now. There's others who are looking at if those people get a 5-story building, that the others are gonna wanna have it because they're all just watching to see if it gets approved or not. And that's right within feet of the Neponset River and the area that has had some issues with the cemetery around the corner that abuts several of those projects. So I think that's one of those things that you've got to also think about to not add trouble to it. When you think about the areas that are going to get flooded, that evaluation has to happen to say, these potentially will get flooded. What are we doing to make sure that properties are not added on to places that could potentially, in the not so different, just in future, have an impact on the whole riverway there. So that's just from looking at the pictures, it kind of brought home some of the areas that would be affected, in
It's
the.
a really good point. And I think when we talk about the adaptation approaches and different degrees of marsh migration, or essentially excluding future development if it's going to be marsh, is an opportunity to talk through some of those.
Oh, the people who live in Quincy, I haven't seen that, I mean, Milton, I haven't seen them in a while. There was a couple who said their cellar was getting flooded and things like that.
Over in the riverside.
Yeah, so that's already happening. And then I know that people at times have talked about development on Granite Ave on the Milton side of it, which is really low. So it's just sort of like thinking about including information about what smart things we can do to not create problems that we know from these things could be in the not so distant future.
Right. Sort of putting more people into harm's way.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think it's a good point, especially, looking at the models that Kirk has laid out. In case 4, it's migration into undeveloped areas. It's only true if it stays undeveloped, right? So those reductions and changes in building flooding are based on buildings that exist today. And obviously there's a lot of interest in developing some of those areas that maybe some of this lays out why other locations are better.
Right. They look great.
Yeah, and I did want to emphasize one other thing that Kirk mentioned, but I think may have slipped by, which is that this is just looking at sea level based flooding. It's not counting rain, which is going to amplify the problems in a lot of areas.
In adding to your comment about the evacuation plans, they're obviously very insufficient because they don't even tell you where to go. And they're leading you down Granite Ave, which floods in itself, so, but this was brought up at a city neighborhood group, the Harborfront Neighborhood Alliance. Chris, you might have been there, Chris Osgood, and we talked about that there weren't very good evacuation plans, and especially for the people that are living along the coast. Where do you go? In the storms in 2018, a lot of people were shut out of their homes, either stuck in their homes and couldn't get out, or stuck away from their homes and couldn't get back, because Morrissey and the Neponset Circle were totally flooded. So there's no direction about where to go, what to do. And they said they were working on it, and they were going to come around the neighborhoods and have meetings, but that hasn't happened yet. So.
Maybe it's been discussed through municipalities, but I keep thinking when you brought us over to that State Street complex, which
So low.
and I'm thinking from a taxpayer point of view and from a development point of view, that's owned by businesses. And if it's gonna flood, I'm sure the businesses are gonna come back and say, hey, you could buy me out for $1 gazillion, as opposed to just letting it flood. I just thinking about the taxes and with the funding to, I guess, take that tar out of there. I guess that would help the situation. But
And I
the
think,
reality is, I don't know that ever would get funded.
it's certainly an option, and there's something that the municipal staff of Quincy have raised significant concerns about, and I think we're going to get into in the second half talking about different ways. There's gradations between we don't do anything to it and we raise all the buildings and let the marsh take it back over. Do they need all of the parking area they have right now? And ways to maybe take another look at that. But it does require buy-in from the below. And Chris maybe is going to bring up this point, but Boston has looked at the Planet Fitness near Neponset Circle, but they're a private landowner until they're willing to sell or willing to engage in that conversation. There's not much you can do about that. Chris, did you want to chime in?
Yeah, quick, just building on Mary and Patty's points, which the Office of Emergency Management is doing some continued hazard mitigation, disaster preparedness, evacuation route planning, as was referenced. If it makes sense, happy to think about how to connect some of that work with this study so that we can have a sense of how those two sort of near-term response and longer-term adaptation efforts connect. So let me know. Happy to make those connections, and also happy to make sure that we're finding an opportunity for the OEM team to come back and brief the broader neighborhood too.
Great.
I was just gonna add one other comment about the marsh migration things, and your comment is, for purposes of modeling, they've sort of assumed like, we will magically keep the marsh from going into this developed area, but that, because our scope is not, it's more about the marsh than about protecting the buildings. But I do think one of the interesting questions here, as you were alluding to, is if you don't want someplace like State Street or various other neighborhoods to flood, and you don't want to let the marsh go there, maybe the marsh will help a little bit if it could protect it, but it's not going to completely solve the problem. It really does beg the question, who is going to spend the money necessary to keep that land able to continue functioning as developed land? Is that something where they're looking for the city to buy them out? Is it something where they're looking for the city or the state to pay for a very elaborate flood control system that's going to keep the water out? Is that something where the private landowner is going to do that? And those are all sort of really big questions that are sort of just glossed over in this scenario where they're like, well, we just won't let anything develop and flood.
Can I just ask, because I don't think I've necessarily noticed this in other times that I've seen the presentation, is the 93 bridges, the Neponset Bridge being showing water depth over it. Like, is that reality, or we're talking that's just how high it is below the bridge?
It's just a graphic.
Yeah, Kirk, I think I'm pretty sure the answer is the highways are not themselves underwaters. You're looking at the land below.
So yeah, so in order for for us to simulate the water movement, we just take the bridges out. The bridges are much higher than the water elevations would be. And if we put them in the model, right, as a two-dimensional model, it would block the flow of water just because the way the models work. So no fears on the bridges. The bridges themselves are fine. They're not inundated or underwater or at any threat throughout the whole system. That's not true everywhere, but for the Neponset, that's true.
Well, it's not true of Granite Ave Bridge.
I was going to say Granite.
Granite Ave Bridge, the water actually went up to the bridge in 2000.
Yeah, Granite Ave Bridge is a yeah, I'm talking
Yeah.
about the ones that go over the Neponset, the major roads. But yeah, Granite Ave in general is one of the lower areas in the whole region. So
Sea levels were a lot lower when it was built. We'll show some historic maps in a bit, and it's one of the few things that's been here the whole time.
There was a lot of water coming down the river at the same time that the water was coming in the storm. So you had both.
yeah, that's automatically built into the model, the freshwater discharge down the river. It also includes a 2070 downscaled version of the discharge down the river. So
Well, unless there are more questions, I know, as I said, we've got until June 11th to digest this, follow up with everyone to make sure we get every question answered and things, but maybe we want to move on to the next section and talk about bad patient cases. So,
Let's switch over to. All right. So I'm going to talk about adaptation approaches, and to reiterate what Sean said, these aren't like alternatives to choose from, but rather, rather different pathways that adaptation could or might take that we can then evaluate for their implications. So where the first round of cases really tested, what might happen if certain things happen to the marsh, or we did, these take increasingly expansive or intensive approaches to marsh restoration that we can evaluate the flood risk reduction benefits too. And ultimately, and we can jump to the next slide. So I'm going to talk through these. But first, it's really kind of hard and a little disorienting to look at the estuary as a whole. But also when we model these and look at these, we are thinking about the estuary as a whole, both in terms of how flood impact water might move through it and flood impacts, but also the extent of marsh. But we're also going to be looking at, what we might call individual marsh segments or marsh complexes within that. And we've broken this down into really 10 sub areas that relate to that are organized according to sort of connected complexes of existing marsh that have different you sort of are connected hydrologically or physically, but also have sort of shared characteristics or marsh health. And they have sub areas, and we'll get into that at the end. But it's helpful to kind of look at these in these subsegments. And when I go through, partly just because it's visually hard to look at the whole estuary, as I go through these adaptation cases, we're going to focus first on this upper reach segments 1 and 2, and then we're going to take a zoomed in look at the Sagamore Creek marshes. That's area 4 in green. And then we can jump to other segments as I talk about it, but it's helpful to see these. So, like I said, we're first going to kind of zoom in to this, the upper reach segments 1 or 2, which one is what we're dubbing the Dorchester marshes, and 2, the Gulliver Creek's marshes. We've kind of named each of these complexes by the creek or historic creek that was there. And so if we look just next slide, sort of at the, what might happen here with no intervention. First, you can see sort of some of the degraded state of the existing marsh through all of the mosquito ditching. But the light blue line is that future mean high water, what's going to be underwater regularly at high tide. And you can see that the dappled green and the dappled purple that represent those areas where marsh would migrate if not kept out. So you kind of get a sense of the extent. And you'll see one of those marsh migration areas, as we just discussed earlier, is the landing point of the Granite Avenue Bridge. So yes, it is very low. So really, we can go to the next slide. Taking lessons learned from those first cases that Kirk outlined, we've taken one of the things that we've understood is really proved both benefits to retaining marsh extents and health, as well as provided some flood risk reduction benefits, was focusing on keeping the marsh we had. So the first case we're calling restoration, which is really focused on restoration and adaptation of existing marsh. And then adding on a little bit of case 3 or 4 of facilitating marsh migration into existing natural areas where you're seeing it migrate in the model. So this is kind of our lowest touch case. It's definitely not no action. We have to intervene to get all the degraded marshes back to high health and to help them adapt to sea level rise. But this is just to kind of go over in the conceptual diagram of that. And some of the techniques, next slide, that this entails. I'm going to be talking about restoring marsh, but what that is going to entail in most of these marshes, based on the analysis that Woods Hole Group has done in the state of the estuary, is we're talking about ditch remediation, so filling in some of those mosquito ditches. In some places, adding marsh sill to make sure we're not eroding and losing the edge of the marsh, as you saw in some of those cases. Cases 3 and 4, managing invasives to make sure we're able to maintain vegetation. And then we're also, might seem, fill in the ditches, but we actually need to restore hydrologic connectivity in many of these. This can be runneling, which is small scale sort of connecting of inland areas that might not drain anymore. Breaching sort of artificial berms that have been built, or creating culverts or culvert enlargements, and in some instances creating larger channels to restore historic creek channels. And so next slide, just diagrammatically what that looks like in this area. That the Dorchester marshes are in varying degrees of health now, but to really keep them as marshes over time is going to entail breaching some of these berms, likely regrading, and in the same with the Gulliver creek marshes. So this is our restoration only, but in this instance, really limiting our intervention largely to the footprint of the marsh we have today and just adjacent vegetated natural areas, not developed, not parkland. So really that limited footprint. And what can we do? Next slide. So the next one we're calling restoration and assisted migration. So really taking that, case one, that restoring the marshes, and adding the marsh migration to anywhere that really is, again, if it is natural areas, but expanding that to be areas that are parkland, even if they are used for recreational uses today. And in some instances, we'll see parking lots as long as they don't interfere with access to buildings or water dependent land uses. So in going back to the discussion we had, okay, what if we allow these areas where we're seeing potential future marsh migration, regular inundation at high tide, and saying, you know what, we're not going to try to make it stay there. We're going to let it become marsh. And then again, as in all the others, adaptive management over time. So next slide, if we look at that zoomed in area, what does this look like? Oh, so sorry. This is just to say that we're adding, take all those techniques that I mentioned before, and we're adding these upland, these marsh migration into natural areas, parkland, and developed land, as long as it's not interfering with access roads or buildings. Next slide. So what does that look like? Oh, sorry, this is the last case. So sorry, this is just the restoration. And then we'll jump to the next case just so you can see the difference because it's a little subtle. So we've taken all the adjacent natural areas and said, if the water wants to go there anyways, we're going to let the marsh migrate, right? So you can see some of that happening. But unlike the last iteration, we're proactively connecting areas that don't interfere with development. So in terms of connecting the culvert under Granite Avenue and really reintroducing the pond and the golf course to tidal and marsh, and connecting those the islands and the traffic interchanges of I-93 to that marsh complex. Can we use that to expand our marsh area and take in tides? So that's that case too. So the next step is sort of an iteration that says we're still, we're not going to let marsh, we're not going to turn critical infrastructure or buildings into, into marsh or let marsh go there. We'll still stop that. But really, any parking lots or water dependent uses that any other developed areas, be they parking lot, paved, as long as they're not an actual building or a piece of critical infrastructure, we're gonna let that restore if it looks like if it's connected to the marsh and it would flood normally in the future. So if we go to the next slide.
Does that include houses?
And what doesn't include houses. So we're stopping short of buildings. Next slide. So you can kind of see in the next slide, you can focus on, so if you go back one, we kind of, in the second adaptation approach, restoration and assisted migration, we really kept it limited to parks and natural areas and areas of parking lot that didn't have access to building. So now we're introducing more of those paved areas. Next slide. So in the where the DOT facility is between Granite Avenue and I-95, you'll see in this more expanded scenario, really taking over all of that paved area and allowing marsh to migrate into basically everywhere that that is below the future mean high water line. You can see it right there. Thanks, Sean. But that does require conversion of, large swaths of parking lot, into unpaved areas and taking them out of the mix. And obviously, influences those buildings, but doesn't flood them. And so the last case, as you might guess from where I'm going, is really expansion and restoration of historic marsh extents. What would happen if we really looked towards restoring the historic hydrologic connections and extent of marsh? We colloquially internally call this the revenge of the marshes, simply because it really starts to beg that question that I think was introduced, what if everywhere that was marsh or wanted to be marsh could be there? So really putting no limits on it. And next slide, I think we have a picture of the historic marsh extent. So again, we're doing that waterward expansion. So another thing that we've looked at through this process to really understand some of those historic hydrologic connections and why we might, and it really corresponds to where we're seeing some inland flooding, is the historic marsh extent. So what you're looking at here is really this upper reach in 1921, and it doesn't look that much different than it did in the 1800s. And you'll see this place that says Mount Hope. That's pretty much where the golf course is now. And that inland sort of branch coming in is where that pond is now. And you'll see the rail line and Granite Ave, like I mentioned. I-93 is not here yet, but Granite Ave is there, and you can see between the rail line and Granite Ave where that DOT facility was really just historically mostly marsh. So next slide. So again, this, we didn't flip back and forth. Sorry, I must have hit that. But so in this instance, not taking out roads, and critical access routes, but really allowing those developed areas to return to marsh if they were historically marsh. And so you can see that would remove all the buildings between I-95 and Granite Avenue and really restore them to marsh. And there's a benefit in terms of, we're increasing the marsh extent, but what we'll really want to model for is understanding, do we see flood risk reduction benefits beyond, obviously, those buildings that are not there flooding. So next.
So is the area on the map you just had where it was gray, just to the right, up, go to there, that area to the left, that circle that it would be in, is that marshland now, the gray part? Nope, above it.
That's the golf course.
That's,
That's the golf course. Yeah, so sorry.
So it's a hill.
The white area, the sort of area that's got a white mask on it, if it's just a normal gray aerial, it means
Okay, right.
it's in our study area. And the sort of white overlay mask means it's outside of our study area. And what that means is that's the extent of the future 100-year storm in 2070 using Kirk's modeling. So if it's masked in white, it is very, very unlikely that it will flood, right? The 1% annual chance that like FEMA storm in 2070 with all that sea level rise doesn't go further than that. So
the part closest to Granite Ave would flood, but the part a little in.
Yeah.
What
north of
yeah. So it's really these areas, and I realized this title got long and it kind of obscured some of this. We can jump into the Miro board afterwards, but yeah, it really is those low-lying houses at the point, and on the Dorchester side, the commuter rail line.
Okay, thank you.
We'll see. So again, these incremental, yeah, if you go to the 4-up. So again, this incremental approach of keeping things kind of, what can we do, limiting ourselves to the current marsh extents and quote unquote natural vegetated areas? What if we adapt the marsh, but allow it to migrate into parkland, convert parking lots? Are we seeing benefits? What if we expand that into a larger footprint of developed areas, but not buildings? And then the sort of fourth or more, the next step, the more extreme increment of restoring that historic marsh footprint, and also allowing mudflat to marsh conversion. And I'll quickly run through that sequence. for the Sagamore Creek area as well. And then we can pause and we can talk about the adaptation approaches or zoom into any other areas. So next. So Sagamore, this is Sagamore Creek and the developed area here. And so next slide, if we look at the future. So I dropped this one in here. This is just the modeling. So remember the dark blue, sorry, the dark green stippled area, which there's not a lot of, is marsh migration into undeveloped areas. And the purple is where that model that Kirk ran said, this is where marsh will go or wants to go unless you stop it. So just for reference, this entrance area is very low. So next slide. In the first case, restoration, we don't get a lot here, except the lower fringing areas to the left of the screen. We could prevent marsh erosion with these sills. But next slide. We start, we skipped one.
Oh, it's gonna went back a bunch. No?
Huh. This sequence is really, oh, there we go. Okay, I was like, we didn't make that jump. So in this assisted migration, again, limiting the migration to expanding beyond the current marsh extents, but limiting it to just paved areas that don't access buildings as well as developed parkland. What if we let that one parking lot that's slated to flood at high tide anyways convert to marsh? We get more marsh area. Question, will we see any flood benefits in those frequent storms to those other low-lying areas? Next slide. Taking that a step further to say, what if we allow undeveloped areas outside of buildings to restore to marsh? And this one is probably the most extreme case. That's why I'm showing it, to restore the hydrologic connection between that upper marsh and lower marsh on Sagamore Creek. We would have to, come up with some new transportation connections or rebuild a road as a bridge instead of an at-grade road to make this work, but we would expand that marsh expansion. And then the really extreme case, or the really extreme would be, again, to look at that historic extent and say, where was it marsh historically? And what would the trade-offs be with that? And it actually wasn't that long ago that it was marsh historically. I think the first map was 1921, but as recently as 1970, Sagamore Creek was largely marsh. And then next slide. So to put that back, short of maintaining roadway connections, we'd end up with that entire complex actually converting to marsh. So again, a very extreme case. The other thing I'll note here, on the left, you'll see the expansion of marsh waterward, which is to say we're looking at, the adaptation and the conversion of mudflat to marsh, because we understand the marsh provides more benefit for flood risk reduction than the mudflat. But again, those are trade-offs ecologically. So that's a zoom in on this extreme case. So we want to step back and look at these at the estuary scale too, but it was really helpful to kind of see them at these individual segments, and we can zoom around and look at other ones. But again, not intended to be alternatives, but rather these incrementally expansive approaches to restoration to help us understand, what the benefits and trade-offs for flood risk reduction. See them next slide at estuary wide. And And we can zoom in and out on these if there's other areas we want to look at afterwards. And the next slide just reiterates, is sort of a diagram that reiterates what I've been framing, that we have taking this sort of incrementally expansive, but also easier, right? Easier to do, to intervene, to permit, to construct, to adapt, basically. And then finally, before I open it up for discussion, I just want to go back to the overall estuary reaches and say, we've zoomed in on 2 focus areas to really explain and present the approaches. But we're looking at this across all the reach segments. And we've actually also characterized these and prioritized them. If you jump to the next slide, according on their relative need for restoration. And this is based on the state of the estuary analysis on the current marsh health and ability to thrive in the future. So sort of ranging from very healthy but vulnerable up to really not healthy and vulnerable. We've also, based on Kirk's initial modeling, we won't really know until we model these adaptation approaches, but based on the initial model results, what is the potential for flood risk reduction by segment? And so if you jump to the next slide, this is a lot of information, but just to say that the adaptation approaches are informed by this relative priority. So you'll see that some have relatively high potential for flood risk reduction and are not as healthy, and part of the focus that we've put on that upper reach of segments 1 and 2. And then they have differing levels of flood risk reduction potential and health that can inform our prioritization of focus areas to do. Kirk, you can jump. We can talk about this a little bit in the discussion, but where we might do more zoomed in or finer grained modeling of the restoration options. Yeah, those were just, these are just some additional slides. Do you want to jump back to like slide 67 with the approaches? And I can also, the mirror board was really heavy, so I took out just the slides, Sean, that we have in here if we want to zoom in around and look at that, if that's easier.
First, and then pull the mirror board, dive a little bit more. Just to emphasize again that these are kind of 4 buckets to look at, and we don't know what this is before they go into the model to say how it's going to change the benefit. So even the farthest extreme one of replacing everything with where the marsh used to exist historically, we still don't know, is that going to change it to be 1 less building flooded or 100 plus buildings flooded. So this is not a recommendation that we obviously go to the furthest extreme and saying it's worth looking at all of them, even if in some areas it's not feasible or wanted to restore the marsh where it is. I think what we've been advocating for, at least internally, is that it's worth taking a look at to get both the extreme ends and then what might be feasible at individual segments.
So can I just clarify? We're project partners on this, but I haven't been going to the meetings, so this is really useful for me. So the modeling that Kirk presented was just setting up the model and doing some really coarse work to see what might work. And now we're getting into more specific approaches for different reaches, and we'll plug those into the model. Is that right?
Exactly.
Okay. Yep. Great, thank you.
So version 1 was kind of like Kirk presses a button and makes all the marshes magically rise to feet. And this is more like, well, we'll do this here and that there. Oh, we can go into there. And
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, the initial modeling was really to try to define the bounds of what might be possible, right? and identify, would this even matter at all to do, right? And
Yeah.
then if it does, where should we focus and prioritize our efforts, right? So, to do a full scale Neponset, to raise the elevation of all the marshes probably isn't really cost feasible or even, regulatory feasible, but can we identify where we're going to get the most benefits, right? And then how to prioritize those. And then now digging into what works: hydraulic connections, filling in ridges and runnels, ditching, elevation, all this type of stuff is really now we're getting into for, how they perform.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And so, yeah, if you think back to the results, the first results that Kirk showed, when you look at case 2, which is like the marsh keeping up with sea level rise, you did see flood risk, pretty significant flood risk reduction, or even in extents, but also depths, particularly in those upper reaches, right? So Kirk, jump in if I'm misspeaking, but that elevation approach, that's sort of why restoration, adaptation, helping the marshes keep up with sea level rise is across all of these, right? That was a benefit. But also when I showed the prioritization at the end, those upper reaches of 1 and 2 really are showing significant benefits. What we realized that the initial cases didn't look at the expansion, right? The sort of more extreme expansion of marshes. So those are things we might explore, or we can explore.
So Kirk, what kind of feedback from people would be helpful at this point? I mean, we've sort of crammed a giant amount of information at you. And I've seen that this has been evolving because I've seen two previous drafts of this presentation, and I still find myself pondering it a little bit. What does it all mean? But what kind of input would be useful at this point?
Kirk, do you want to start?
Yeah, I'll start. So to me, what we're looking at as we head into the modeling and adaptation is there certain features, elements, infrastructure, criticality that really is important to the communities, to individuals, to the look, feel of everything, right? So like it absolutely, is critical that we have this. And I'm not talking about evacuation routes and things like that we know, right? But are there things that are like, this particular area, I couldn't ever envision not having, a marsh to look at, or I couldn't ever envision losing this neighborhood or this community, even though it's right on the marsh, or those types of, or this park is really, really important, for X, Y, and Z reasons. So understanding some of those pieces from a community perspective really helps us guide and focus some of the adaptation approaches in the modeling efforts. And I know we shoved a lot of information at you very quickly, and the answers might not be right now, but those are the types of things I think would help as you go through this and think about this as your estuary, as your system. Where are the most important things to you and to your community? And then Pip, I don't know if you want to add to that, but that's one piece that's important from my perspective.
Yeah. And then I think, seeing the relative expansion of marsh, just understanding if that incremental approach makes sense, is something you want to see. Or do we think that we think it's valuable to kind of look at that extreme restoration to understand and bookend if it could have an impact. But if it's so implausible that it's not even worth looking at, I think that's feedback that we would want to know too. Because, there's a lot there, in discovering that it was a lot of area that was historically marsh that it's not today. And then, Ian, I think one thing that we didn't talk about that you've brought up is the waterward expansion of marsh and the conversion of mudflat to marsh, and whether to look at that, like whether to limit looking at that to one adaptation approach to that, only that fourth bucket or not.
But just to follow up on that, can I ask one question, which is, there's the question whether to include the kind of waterward expansion, but is it also worth asking whether that should be in the last bucket, or before looking at moving to developed areas, you add that waterward expansion? Basically,
Yeah.
would it be, is it a question that you're asking, should maybe the marsh expansion waterward be in the second bucket, where before you start moving into building space?
That, Sean, I think that is how Ian had asked it before. And yeah.
Okay, great.
Is there any examples of other places in New England or Massachusetts where similar projects and were any of them implemented, and were they successful or highs and lows? So we had some sort of comparison to what feasibility there might be.
Don't.
In Delaware.
I can, yeah. So there's a few cases of various approaches. So again, one of the tough things about this is, right, it's really preparing for future conditions, which we haven't yet experienced. We're getting there. Maybe we're getting there quicker than we want. But I'll give you a few examples. So thin layer deposition projects have happened in Rhode Island and Connecticut. Rhode Island specifically, we did a project in Integrit Marsh where it basically increased the marsh plain elevation to restore marsh and provide protective benefits. That's still in process. So do we know the results of that? No, because it takes a long time to monitor that and figure out what's happening. But so far, the marsh has reestablished and shown itself to be able to handle that so far. So that's one example of a case. Up in the Great Marsh system in Massachusetts, Newburyport, Newbury, that area, Salisbury. Cynthia is very familiar with this. They've been doing a lot of ridges and runnel restoration work, trying to better control mosquito ditching that has happened, better drainage of salt pan areas, get the water off the marsh for restoration purposes. So that's a kind of resiliency technique that has shown really some positive benefits. And again, we're waiting to see how the future holds. It's a long, it's a marathon here, not a sprint in terms of that. So there's those projects happening. Herring River Restoration Project in Wellfleet, Mass is a huge restoration project that does have some elements of this in terms of marsh restoration, adaptive management, hydraulic channels and work in that regard, vegetative cutting. They're going to also have to do some placement to get subsided areas back up to the proper elevation over time. So there's a number of places where the different types of techniques we're talking about have been applied. Some places in the Mid-Atlantic have done a lot of living shoreline work with the kind of sills that Pippa was talking about, and then filling in areas. So the expansion into waterways has been done in Maryland, Delaware areas with the living shoreline sills and that type of approach. So there's been projects for sure that have been done in New England and the Mid-Atlantic that look at building marsh migration in certain areas has also been applied. So yes, do we know the exact outcome of all of them? No, only because it takes time for that to be monitored and figure out what's happening.
Yeah, a couple of projects in my neck of the woods that speak to some of the marsh expansion and thin layer placement in Barnegat Bay in New Jersey, and a very different context, but Jamaica Bay with Marsh Island restoration. So we have a sense of kind of what it takes. And in terms of like the, developed area transition to marsh, we're seeing a little bit of that in New Jersey. There's a Blue Acres program, so a lot areas that were had repetitive flood loss or were damaged during Sandy. Some have chosen to sort of convert lower lying areas of towns to natural areas. But again, as Kirk said, like testing that, looking at that over a 20, 30, 50-year period hasn't been done yet, right? So there are other places that are kind of looking at some of these or applying some of these restoration techniques that Kirk talked about, and also looking at some of these long-term trajectories, but we haven't tested them for 20 or 30 years because these are all examples from the past, decade.
An area that I'm interested in, being from Milton, is the Riverside area that currently floods. And certainly, there will be increased flooding in that area. Historically, it was a marsh, but there's, 20, 30 homes down there that flood regularly. And so, it's a big public policy point of view, whether you try to protect those homes
Mm-hmm.
be counter to, our approach of a natural management and restoration of the marshes. So I didn't see a lot on the slides that kind of showed dealing with that area at all. I guess just maybe the assumption was that they were going to be protected somehow.
Do you want me to jump over to the Miro board, Kurt? Sean, I
Yeah.
don't know if I can share screen.
And that would be the best way to look at that area. I
Yeah,
think.
I'm gonna try to see if this works.
Kind of goes to my,
Yeah, all right.
have we started to talk to towns like Milton about managed retreat and Quincy?
Yeah.
Because that's
Right.
what we're talking about.
Right, exactly.
That's the real.
I think you can see my screen now. This is a bit of a messy map, but it's helpful to look at in terms of the sort of light blue cyan line being the future, the future mean high water line, and all the houses kind of all the buildings highlighted in pink are buildings that would flood in high tide in 2070. So you're looking at like Riverside Ave over here, right?
Riverside there, and the ones closer in, they're flooding
Over
out.
here. Yeah. So when we look at the adaptation approaches for that area, let's see. I think we can see them best on, yeah. So we're looking at these areas. I'm gonna try to, there we go. So the restoration, oh dear, I'm gonna try to zoom. So this is the restoration only. And Kirk, you think part of the question is the restoration and adaptation of this marsh over time that's not going to reduce flood risk in those extreme storms, but will that adaptation reduce regular frequent inundation in these areas?
And that's something we'll be looking at through this process for that area.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah. And then in the second approach, there's not a lot of expansion of marsh directly here, but we've expanded marsh area into the triangles, converted some of this parking, and it, Kirk weigh in, but could that have an impact? And then in this larger area, we are continuing by expanding that floodable marsh area, will it have any benefits to those low-lying areas? Again, for the extreme events and storms, that's not going to have a benefit, but for those, based on the results of some of the initial modeling, there's the potential for it to reduce the extent or reduce the depth of flooding in some of those more frequent storms. Kirk, I think that's, I'll let you take over any hypothetical modeling results.
Yeah, that's correct.
That's what we want to test.
Yeah, we're still, I mean, this is exactly the type of stuff we are testing to figure out what matters. And then maybe in that particular case, like if the marsh by itself can't provide adequate protection, then it's a hybrid type approach where you're looking at restoration, but also some kind of protective measures, nature-based protective measures for that particular area. So,
Or managed retreat. I mean, those areas, they flood enough now that, the road's not usable, the utilities flood, they're going to be major infrastructure projects to, protect 10 homes down there.
right.
So that, I guess that's beyond the scope of what you guys are doing, but I think the reality is there's probably going to be a lot of homes that disappear in that area.
And I do think comparing the adaptation approaches here, it's almost like in this neighborhood, it doesn't look like a lot's happening between version 1, 2, and 3. And I think that's because there's not a lot that can happen until you get to 4, where you're letting houses go.
Right.
That's why there's a big
And
comparing the 4
But
steps.
the house that floods, up to the first floor level now is going to be flooding significantly higher. So, I don't think there's, absent protective measures, those are probably going to disappear.
Yet knowing all
are
that,
we?
proposed to put condominiums right on the other side of Granite Ave where it's all, you're being proposed to let it return to marsh. So, I mean,
You're
how do we get,
misinterpreting what was being proposed.
well,
But that's all right.
That's
all right. We'll get there.
the green area there, so
Yep.
the marsh is gonna go back, right?
Yep.
So,
Can I, I just
to-
have some questions about clarifying the areas we're talking about. Are the low-lying roads that flood today, those two like the red lines that I drew?
Closer to the highway ramps.
Those.
Yeah, the one on the left.
The one on the left is, for sure.
So all of these.
Circle, yeah.
Yeah, Cortland Circle there, plus the Riverside.
Okay.
But the worst of it is Riverside Drive.
That faces the marsh, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. And where you're saying there's proposed development over here?
yeah,
They're part of our MBTA zoning proposal was to allow development there, realizing that it could never be developed. It was a way to provide you to satisfy the state's requirements, realizing that there was no way it could ever be developed.
Yeah.
It's off the table now.
so that was removed.
I think this is an interesting area
People upset.
for increment, because this does call attention to the fact that this this area between Granite Ave and I-93, it's one we spent a lot of time talking about, because it is very low lying, and basically this whole area wants to be marsh, and so it may be a good prompt to understanding the relative benefit of having the marsh there, because it will flood anyways, whether or not we let the marsh go there or not. And so I think one thing that, Kirk, jump in, but we're keen to really understand is, what is the benefit of all of that being marsh? It takes those buildings are not at risk if they're not there, but if it has additional flood risk reduction benefits to areas outside that could be, that's another part of that conversation.
The part where it says the words actually Granite Ave, that's at the ramp part of it. That part only goes down to one lane, as you're going through it because the left lane towards the center floods. So when you're trying to go down the road, you've got the cars who are going on and off of the highway, right where the word is written there. And then people have to kind of move over to the right lane because the left lane is flooded. So that whole area probably is the most problematic for the homes and there. And then when you look at the other side is like, you know, as we've seen, the area that's heading towards Cedar Grove Cemetery gets a little higher all the time. So those areas are the ones I see often as being problematic and the people who live. I always get confused with that Milton Quincy part right there. So I know that the people live in Milton, but it seems like it's sort of like was Quincy at some point.
Did you determine Route 93 will flood? Because it's pretty level with the marsh right after you cross Granite Ave Bridge, that area.
Sorry, I'll jump
Go-
over to this map, which is the extent Kirk, but I mean, you can
all
see,
you have to do is look at the extent. You'll
Yeah,
be able to tell. I just can't see it in this working map, but
yeah, I can see it in the work, like this floods and
Yeah,
this,
the
this
flooded.
floods. But I don't think the I-95, or sorry, I-93 actually floods outside of the 100 year.
yeah.
So if there is observed flooding on 93, we should check, but
Well, they get when it dips down in Milton, but that's more from the rainwater, I think, rather than the.
Yeah, it floods because it rains heavily and it has poor drainage,
Yeah.
but it's not a coastal flooding issue.
yeah.
Over some construction projects, there used to be much work. They'd have to actually have the people get off the
Yeah,
highway.
we're seeing,
Yeah.
yeah,
Right,
granite up here, but we're not showing 93 flooding from coastal.
I know that we're not looking at the Squantum, but the area of Marina Bay, I'm having to assume that was all marsh.
Yes.
And was filled. So that must have impacted a lot of why the water goes where it does now. Or lack of it.
Yeah, I was gonna mention, talking about developed areas and taking them away. I mean, we're focusing on State Street South. And one of the things that can be done at State Street South is to, if they need parking and they're gonna lose the parking area, they're gonna lose them anyway because they're gonna start flooding. But if you lose them and encourage them to go back in the marsh, you can make much smaller footings with a parking garage.
Right.
And still have the same number of parking spots. They probably don't even need as many because there's so many people working online now and everything too, but, you know, that could help. There's also, little inlets here and there along the river, and they're small. They maybe used to be places where boats were launched and they're not launched anymore, but those might be good seeding grounds to get a marsh to start growing again. And the other place that I was thinking of was, I know they're not gonna tear down State Street South, but Boston Scientific is basically just a warehouse. And it's a huge part of Marina Bay area. And then there's another whole area where they store boats and things like that. And it's like, you know, maybe those places could easily be relocated, I don't know.
There's a FedEx there now, and there are
FedEx and
Scientific is
they're in the same building, yeah, it's
Yeah,
a big,
yeah,
huge building
yeah.
right along the water there, yeah.
So
You can see it there in the white.
Sorry, which
There's two
Just to the
pieces,
right.
like,
Building right in the center.
Square and rectangular.
Go north.
Buildings.
oh, the north, sorry, I wasn't sure where, I couldn't hear what we were talking about. Were we talking about the point or
yeah,
That huge building.
the big building? Yeah.
just recently, over the last few years, built a new condo building farther up, so that took more land away. The other big angle
Yeah.
at the top.
Yeah,
That's,
I'll just,
and I think I heard that's the last one they can build.
Don't count on it.
But,
don't
yeah,
know
right,
that.
they'll change the
No.
rules, yeah,
They're eyeing Squantum Point Park.
yeah.
yeah, so looking at the outer, the Quantum Point area in that fourth case scenario, we would be looking at saying what, is there, what happens if all of that converts. Kind of using our rules of thumb in the second, the third scenario, just the sort of expanded migration, we did not we did not remove that building, but the fourth case would look at that essentially managed retreat scenario.
That's so far close to the bay that it wouldn't have a huge impact on flooding elsewhere, right?
Right, Kirk? I mean, this is the,
Yeah, that is too close to the
yeah,
bay. Yeah,
It would make beautiful habitat.
yes.
it would. That's for sure.
Out, but there's not likely to be a very significant flood risk.
Just flooding, it's saving
Oh,
habitat
exactly,
and creating habitat.
Yeah.
But if I put these in the marsh expansion kind of conditions, where in that third scenario, we're really maintaining the current marsh extents and, adding sills to prevent erosion, but in the fourth, looking at the potential benefits or impacts of expanding the marsh. And Kirk, I don't know if you want to speak to that, but I think it's a question as to whether or not that could benefit or could actually not benefit flood risk reduction, because we don't know how it will affect the hydrodynamics.
We don't know
Right.
yet. Yeah, that's something
Something that has to be modeled.
Yep.
How would more development there impact it too? I mean, it's sort of like, you don't want to go in a direction where you're actually creating more of a problem ahead of you getting closer to a 100-year storm area, and you're taking away some of the things that would have been the buffer, because that area goes out and does kind of create that part of the river to be a buffer maintaining water in a way. I mean, when you look at how much people put asphalt on everything as they go along, it does make a big difference as to where that water's then running off to.
Right.
Does, but the caveat is that at least the modeling these guys are doing isn't really accounting for rain.
Yeah.
It's more rain where more pavement is gonna, cause a problem. So that, you're right that it's an issue, but it's not one that'll really be captured in this.
No,
I
but
don't
I'm just
think,
saying,
because-
as you're going different paths, you have to kind of like, how do you take and create an environment that isn't getting more in the negative side of it when you're trying to then take back land that was taken when people did develop it?
Right.
And I think that is one thing in the middle scenarios to think about. There are, it wasn't how I framed it before, but I think the conversation earlier we had after the original cases, I'm trying to find where the parking lot goes away, where, in areas where we're taking parking lot that isn't buildings, or allowing marsh migration, that's essentially sort of that argument, right? If you're saying it's a place where marsh will migrate to, you're also restricting it from being developed, right? So that is a potentially different way for us to look at and talk about those areas that are identified for marsh migration or restoration, right? Is proactively not developing them.
I have a question. And I don't exactly know how to phrase this, but it feels like groundwater is important here. I know we're not dealing with rain, but a lot of these areas, like the ones along Granite Ave, are already wet. That is probably because the groundwater table is so high. So in that one scenario in your model where you put a wall up to stop the water from flooding in certain areas, are you accounting for the fact that that might not work because groundwater table will still be so high behind it?
Well, the model doesn't include groundwater, right? So, so there's that part of it. Certainly, increased mean sea level results in driving up groundwater levels. Typically, storms and tides alone don't have that much of effect on groundwater because they're shorter episodic events that can't drive. It's really about the mean sea level condition. So sea level rise is going to cause that problem no matter what we do. Really, it's about potentially mitigating episodic events that occur. So that's the focus, what we're looking at here. But groundwater is something that sometimes gets overlooked and needs to be evaluated for sure.
The smallest flood you were looking at was the 1 year flood. You didn't look at daily tidal flooding, right? Because this is a flood model.
Not in this case. No, this is a flood model. Yeah.
Okay.
But you, Kirk, you did model just the future high tide extents, right?
I mean, we've simulate tidal conditions. Yeah.
Okay. And that, again, this is very messy, but that light, the solid light teal line is that the dark blue is the current mean high water, and the solid lighter blue is high tide, just mean high water.
But tidal influence on groundwater is very limited in terms of geographic distance from the source. It's that mean water surface elevation that really drives it.
Okay. I don't think Boston has future marsh expansion in their planning yet.
No.
They're not even gonna consider it, and there's many parcels. There's already been 5 parcels in Neponset that were in flood zones that have been approved and are in the process of being built. And now there's a lot of empty space down around Galvin Boulevard, which is right on the other side of 93 where water could expand to. And they're ripe for development. I know they're coming next, and you mentioned along Granite Ave, there's like 3 or 4 places. The one on the end is being speculated too, the
Yes.
MRI building.
They're waiting to hear what happens to the one
Exactly.
next door.
Yeah, so that's.
And then there's the parking lot that's of Hilltop, which would be another big one.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Kind of.
yeah, all those places are places that could be future expansion, and they're not even considering that.
Sorry, I thought Galvin Boulevard was more north of here.
No, it's right on the other side of Pope John Paul Park, if you know where that is.
Yeah,
93.
right.
Right next to
So
the.
It does,
in this area.
yes, that area there, there's a lot of empty lots and things that are ripe for development. The big Stop and Shop area where Walgreens is just closed. I think that's the pink outline building, one of the pink. Yeah, right there.
Yeah, all the buildings outlined in pink are below the high water line projected in 2070.
The dark blue, I'm into dark blue.
Can you go down the river a little bit to the cemetery? Yeah, like that.
Upriver or downriver?
Down map. Down map, upriver.
Down, okay, yeah. Yeah, right over here.
Yeah.
This. A little bit
The
more.
cemetery-
Looks
Yeah.
Yeah. There's the cemetery.
Oh, so those houses.
It's right
Granite
down at the
Ave
bottom
Bridge.
there. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, it looks, further down, right?
I can't find it.
Right, the red check mark.
Oh, the bridge. We gotta get back to there.
Yeah, here, this might be hard to read. Let me see if I can go over to one of these. I'll just use the restoration. We can use the marsh extents today. No, I can't. Realize I should have had a better map. That didn't really help, did it?
Yeah, no, that did. That's the trail, the Greenway Trail too. Right, right.
So yeah, those specks is the cemetery there.
So I mean, the cemetery, I think I had said at another meeting, is like, a similar thing happened out on one of the harbor islands where people have been buried on a harbor island. The bodies had to be removed and reinterred, there's the word. Because the water had flooded so much of the area. So that's the kind of thing, especially in the lower part that's closest to the water, that I can see that happening fairly quickly.
Yeah, and those are
Absolutely.
the questions that you need to be having now,
Yeah.
right? Yeah, like, how do we do all that?
That'd be intense.
Yeah.
It's hundreds of graves.
Yeah, they tried to sell me one for my brother. Down in the flood
Get a
zone,
discount.
like New Orleans.
He never was,
Somebody's floating up. Yeah. Oh, my God.
This is really interesting.
So, I mean, I think the thing is that in a lot of our concern is how do you balance all of this? How do you balance the people who have immediate means of having flooding or near flooding at their homes and areas? And then how do you take a look at making environmentally sound choices to take care of the marsh and the ecosystem that's there? And then the other side is, how do you proactively create an area that's in a master plan that you have here to say, what can we do positively, not making negative impacts?
And I think this area of the Dorchester Marshes is an interesting example for that because, and Kurt, please jump in if I get off track here, but this northern marsh area is actually basically too high. It's not very healthy. So one of the things that we've talked about is, well, if you actually eventually it will need to be that high. But right now, if it's going to be healthy marsh and stay marsh, it actually probably needs to be lowered and regraded, right? So restoration here might actually generate some fill that could be could be relocated along the back end of that marsh to create a low berm to keep flooding out of the cemetery area, right? So there are some instances where that balance could be struck in a pretty healthy way. And we're kind of looking for those synergies, but I think this is one of those areas where some modest flood adaptation and aside from simply the marsh restoration could go hand in hand with something that's really going to make the marsh healthier today. Some near term adaptation and marsh restoration. And I think the other area, that it is that zone between Granite Avenue that we've been looking at in terms of what's the right balance between trying to keep it from flooding and letting it flooding and letting marsh in.
It's got another 45 minutes.
Oh.
It's a trooper.
It's 8:30.
So it is 8:30.
Yeah.
So I know we've thrown a lot at everyone, a lot of maps to look at. I think we're, it's been a great conversation, but I'll also follow up with you and with maybe some zoom ins of some of these maps and then some specific questions to follow up on.
But you've captured the things we've said.
Yeah.
We don't have to reiterate that again.
Yeah.
And I do think that, the final solution is we're gonna do something here and something else over there.
Right,
It's gonna be
we
a
don't take
whole,
one.
so it's not one approach,
It's
it's
exactly.
what's feasible and, where there's ownership issues and things like that. So the actual solution is gonna be a mishmash of all these different approaches on different sites.
Well, and if a land ever became available, then to be able to even think about that, like say somebody was tearing down a building, instead of putting another building there, what do you do in regard to building something that's gonna, or you're opening up a land that could be more eco-friendly?
So this could result in a list of, target acquisitions in the future if they become available.
Well, and for
help
the planning
achieve our
departments and the
objectives, yeah.
people to consider
Yeah.
how they make decisions.
Yeah, one of the interesting things that did occur to me as I was looking at this the other day is that certainly the more radical versions of this, where you're moving buildings out of the way, that's probably because we did this study. Nobody's gonna, take State Street away. But at some point, somebody is going to be doing a study of, oh, if we want to keep State Street here, this is what we have to do, and it's gonna cost $9 trillion. And, there may be something that they wouldn't have put together, like, gee, if we took this approach, maybe we should do that, because we don't want to spend $9 trillion on this.
Might be
So-
cheaper to rebuild someplace else.
Yeah, exactly. So it's an interesting trade-off, and we're not creating necessarily the whole picture, particularly in these more radical kind of scenarios.
Well, the State Street area is so gigantic, and the building that's way far in the back often has been empty and, things, but the ones that's closer to the Newport Ave has been substantially, has flipped ownership with people coming in with more offices. Might take a little while, but it's sort of the back ones, that whole entire parking lot is gigantic.
And that's what was interesting about the State Street area is, there's a lot of buildings, but there's a lot of parking. There's a lot of just a lot of paved area. So to your point, like if there, we are talking about like converting parking lots to new development, right? Like maybe that, like what are the options? If you're revisiting those parking lots. But I think, Kirk, looking at some communities that we've worked in that maybe are more on the front lines of this adaptation, Kirk and I have been working in Nantucket with the land bank, and as a result of some modeling that Kirk did, in terms of when things became at flood risk or what areas might actually be beneficial to acquire for flood storage, and this was a stormwater. They weren't really aware of what would provide a benefit. And Kirk, like from your modeling, it did identify certain areas that were going to flood. And they said, oh, that property owner actually came to us, like to ask if it was a priority. Like, well, we can't really think of why it would be a priority. But based on Kirk's modeling, it said this would be a really like a spot where if, converted to stormwater storage could actually benefit flooding in the area. And so it did actually change that decision-making process on priority of land acquisition. So that is, I think, not a here and now, but as you're planning for the future, a good thing to keep in mind.
So we captured stuff in the room. So Annie captured stuff in the room. Thank you, Annie. And then we'll follow up with as this marinates in your brain over the next couple of days.
Yeah.
There's plenty more to add.
And it might help when you send out something to ask people, if you have a couple questions, give us something to respond to it.
And notes for markup, Sean will follow up to, whether we could send a link to the mirror board for people to scribble in or just send PDFs. Like if there's specific areas, I think I tried to catch most of them that people mentioned. But to note those both in terms of what Kirk said about can't imagine something converting, or if there's a place that floods a lot or you think should be, considered for marsh that you're not seeing in one of the scenarios. That'd be helpful to understand.
Did you say you already met with the municipalities?
We did. We met with them middle of last week to talk about this. And I think they had some pretty good feedback that, especially as we emphasized earlier, that this is the beginning of the modeling for this result. We're not, obviously.
Be interesting to me to see what the comments were, because to me, it's all politics.
Yeah. And certainly from Quincy's perspective, the idea of State Street was almost a non-starter. It's not a full non-starter, but it was
a non-starter.
Yeah, I would say it was a full non-starter.
I would say non-starter. Yeah.
I think that this is the point I think you were bringing up earlier, which is that if this is going to cost however many dollars, who's paying for that? Is it the state? Is it the city? Is it the property owner? And at some point, there's a tipping point where they say, if floods X number of days a month, I don't want to be here anymore. And I just go.
Right. Also, that was why I was asking other places that have things, because they've had to get funding from somewhere who wasn't that did come forward.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks everyone for coming.
Everybody should take 2 sandwiches.
All right, thanks everyone.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
everyone.
Have a great evening.
Aye.
Thank you.
For those in the room, I wanted to have our guests that joined us after we started to introduce themselves.
Yeah, hi everyone, sorry for joining. Second to traffic, my name is Ron. I manage the green infrastructure program at Codman Square Neighborhood Development Corporation. So a little bit north, but felt at least relevant to Hoffman to see what you guys are talking about, at least for the sake of protecting the watershed.
Great.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for joining us.
My cousin is the governor of New Jersey, so I was interested when they were talking about
Oh, wow.
what was going on.